The concrete walls of Fort Meridian rose like tombstones against the crimson dawn, their surfaces scarred by years of desperate defense against the endless tide of the undead. Within these walls, 3,000 souls represented all that remained of the human race in what was once the United States of America. Kalen Ashworth pressed his weathered hands against the cold steel of the watchtower's railing, his gray eyes scanning the horizon where countless shadows moved with the unnatural persistence that had become humanity's greatest nightmare. Below him, the courtyard buzzed with the familiar rhythm of survival. Children who had never known a world without zombies played games that mimicked the very horrors lurking beyond their sanctuary, while adults maintained weapons, tended crops, and whispered prayers to whatever god still listened. The smell of cooking fires mingled with the ever-present stench of decay that no amount of wind could fully cleanse from the air. Zephyra Blackthorn emerged from the medical bay, her auburn hair tied back in a practical bun that couldn't quite contain the wild curls that framed her face. Dark circles under her emerald eyes spoke of another sleepless night spent treating the wounded from yesterday's supply run. She had been a neurosurgeon before the world ended, but now she was simply the closest thing to hope that Fort Meridian possessed. Her knowledge of the human brain had proven invaluable in understanding the creatures that prowled beyond their walls, though that understanding brought more questions than answers. Thaddeus Grimwald, the fort's elected leader, called the daily council meeting to order in the converted mess hall. His voice carried the weight of responsibility that had aged him far beyond his 57 years. Around him gathered the department heads who kept their small civilization functioning: Ezekiel Ironwood, the gruff former Marine who commanded their defenses; Lyralei Night Whisper, the brilliant biochemist who had been working on understanding the zombie plague since the early days; and Corvina Starweaver, barely 25 but already the most skilled scout they had ever trained. The meeting began as it always did, with reports of the previous day's activities. Ezekiel's deep voice rumbled through the cramped space as he detailed the latest breach attempts along the eastern wall. The zombies had been more aggressive lately, more coordinated in their attacks. What concerned him most was the way they seemed to be learning, adapting their strategies with each failed assault. Lyralei corroborated his observations with her own disturbing findings from the laboratory, where she had been studying captured specimens. Corvina's report, however, brought a chill to the room that had nothing to do with the approaching winter. During her reconnaissance mission to the ruins of Charlotte, she had witnessed something that defied everything they thought they knew about the undead. The zombies were communicating, not through the mindless groans and shrieks they had grown accustomed to, but through a complex system of gestures and sounds that suggested intelligence far beyond what anyone had imagined possible. Zephyra felt her blood turn to ice as Corvina described watching a group of zombies work together to set what could only be described as a trap for a group of survivors. They had positioned themselves strategically, used tools, and demonstrated planning capabilities that challenged the very foundation of humanity's understanding of their enemy. The implications were staggering and terrifying. The discussion that followed was heated and desperate. Some members of the council refused to believe such reports, clinging to the hope that their enemy remained predictably mindless. Others, like Kalen, recognized the signs they had all been too afraid to acknowledge. The zombie attacks had indeed become more sophisticated over the past months, the creatures showing patience and cunning that spoke of evolution beyond their worst fears. As the council dispersed, Zephyra found herself walking alongside Kalen toward the outer perimeter. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken fears and the weight of knowledge that might be too terrible to bear. Kalen had been one of the fort's original founders, a former federal agent whose investigative instincts had helped them survive the early chaos. His intuition had saved them countless times, and Zephyra knew that if he believed Corvina's reports, then their situation was even more dire than it appeared. The afternoon brought news that made their morning discussions seem almost quaint by comparison. Solace Moonbridge, one of the youngest members of their community at only 8 years old, came running to the gates with tears streaming down her dirt-stained face. She had been playing near the southern fence with her older brother Donovan when they spotted something that shouldn't have been possible. A zombie, standing perfectly still just beyond the perimeter, was watching them. Not wandering aimlessly or clawing at the barriers, but observing with what could only be described as curiosity. When Ezekiel led a team to investigate, they found the area empty, but the implications of Solis's account sent ripples of fear throughout the fort. If the zombies were indeed developing intelligence, then Fort Meridian was not the impregnable sanctuary they had believed it to be. It was merely a puzzle that their enemies were learning to solve, piece by piece, day by day. As darkness fell over their stronghold, Kalen stood once again at his post in the watchtower, but this time he was not watching for the familiar shambling hordes. He was searching for signs of the intelligence that Corvina had witnessed, the calculated patience that Solis had described. In the distance, barely visible in the moonlight, a single figure stood motionless among the shadows, and Kalen realized with growing dread that it was watching him back. 3 days had passed since Solis's disturbing encounter, and the atmosphere within Fort Meridian had shifted from cautious optimism to barely contained panic. Zephyra found herself working longer hours in the medical bay, not just treating physical wounds but attempting to counsel community members who were struggling with the psychological implications of an evolving enemy. Sleep had become a luxury that few could afford, as nightmares of intelligent zombies plotting their destruction haunted even the bravest among them. Lyralii had converted half of her laboratory into a research station dedicated to understanding this new development. Her findings were as fascinating as they were terrifying. The brain tissue samples she had collected from recently fallen zombies showed patterns of neural activity that defied conventional understanding of death and decay. Synapses that should have been completely destroyed were somehow maintaining limited function, creating primitive but functional networks of thought. The plague that had destroyed humanity wasn't just reanimating corpses, it was creating something entirely new. Corvina volunteered to lead another reconnaissance mission, this time accompanied by Donovan Blackwater, Solis's older brother who had recently turned 18 and insisted on joining the scouts despite his youth. The pair had grown up together within the fort's walls, their childhood friendship evolving into something deeper as they faced the harsh realities of their world. Donovan's quick reflexes and natural marksmanship had impressed even Ezekiel, who was notoriously difficult to please when it came to combat readiness. Their mission took them to the abandoned suburbs east of the fort, where intelligence suggested a significant zombie population had been gathering. What they discovered there would forever change how the survivors of Fort Meridian viewed their enemy. In what had once been a residential neighborhood, the zombies had created something resembling a settlement. Crude shelters constructed from debris and abandoned vehicles formed a rough perimeter around a central gathering area where dozens of the creatures stood in organized formations. Most disturbing of all was the evidence of hierarchy among them. Certain zombies, distinguishable by their less advanced state of decay and more coordinated movements, appeared to be directing the others through a complex system of gestures and guttural vocalizations. These leader figures wore primitive decorations fashioned from salvaged materials, suggesting not just intelligence but the emergence of culture among the undead. Corvina and Donovan documented everything they could from their concealed position, using an old digital camera with a telephoto lens to capture evidence that would support their unbelievable observations. They watched in horrified fascination as the zombie leaders organized their followers into groups, each with what appeared to be specific assignments. Some groups were clearly designated for hunting, others for gathering materials, and still others seemed focused on expanding their settlement's perimeter. When they returned to Fort Meridian with their photographic evidence, the council meeting that followed was unlike any in the community's history. The images Corvina and Donovan had captured showed undeniable proof that the zombies were not just evolving mentally but socially as well. They were developing the fundamental building blocks of civilization, albeit in a form that was utterly alien and threatening to human survival. Thaddeus struggled to maintain order as the implications sank in among the council members. If the zombies were capable of organization and planning, then every defensive strategy Fort Meridian had developed was potentially obsolete. Their walls, their weapons, their carefully planned supply runs, everything depended on facing an enemy that was predictably mindless and chaotic. Now they were confronting something that might be capable of strategic thinking and coordinated assault. Ezekiel's military experience told him that their situation had just shifted from defensive survival to a race against time. If the zombies continued to evolve at this rate, they would eventually develop capabilities that could overwhelm even Fort Meridian's impressive defenses. The former Marine began immediately revising their security protocols, implementing new patrol patterns and establishing additional observation posts around the perimeter. Zephyra found herself consumed with questions about the neurological mechanisms behind this evolution. How were damaged brains capable of such rapid development? Was this a natural progression of the plague, or had some external factor triggered this change? Her medical background suggested that such dramatic neural reconstruction should be impossible, yet the evidence was undeniable. She began conducting more intensive examinations of recently deceased zombies, searching for clues that might explain this unprecedented development. Young Solace, despite her age, had become an unexpected source of insight into zombie behavior. Her innocent observations often revealed patterns that adults overlooked, and her encounter with the watching zombie had marked her as someone with a unique sensitivity to their enemy's evolution. She spent hours drawing pictures of the zombies she had seen, her childish artwork capturing details that formal reports often missed. As night fell, Kaylin organized the first of what would become regular enhanced watch rotations. Teams of observers were positioned at every vantage point around Fort Meridian, equipped with night vision equipment and communication devices. Their mission was not just to watch for approaching threats but to study zombie behavior patterns and document any signs of intelligence or organization. The first night of enhanced surveillance yielded results that exceeded their worst fears. Multiple observer teams reported coordinated movement among zombie groups in the distance, with clear evidence of scouts being deployed ahead of main groups and systematic reconnaissance of Fort Meridian's perimeter defenses. The undead were studying them just as intensively as they were studying the undead. Most chilling of all was the discovery that some zombies had begun using tools. Makeshift weapons fashioned from scrap metal and crude implements for digging and construction appeared in the hands of the more advanced specimens. The line between human and zombie was blurring in ways that challenged the very core of what the survivors believed about their enemy and themselves. By dawn, it was clear that Fort Meridian faced a threat unlike anything humanity had confronted before. The zombies were not just evolving, they were awakening to a form of consciousness that made them infinitely more dangerous than anyone had imagined possible. The revelation of zombie intelligence created a schism within Fort Meridian that threatened to tear apart the fragile unity that had sustained them for so long. In the week following Corvina and Donovan's reconnaissance mission, the community divided into two distinct factions, each with fundamentally different views on how to respond to this new threat. The tension was palpable in every interaction, from formal council meetings to casual conversations over meals. Ezekiel led what became known as the militant faction, advocating for an immediate and aggressive response to the zombie evolution. His years of military experience had taught him that when facing an intelligent enemy, the window for preemptive action closes rapidly. He argued passionately for organizing strike teams to attack the zombie settlements before they could develop further, using their current technological advantages while they still possessed them. His followers included many of the fort's security personnel and those who had lost family members to zombie attacks. Opposing him was Lyralii, whose scientific background led her to champion a more cautious approach focused on understanding rather than destruction. She believed that the zombie evolution represented an unprecedented opportunity for scientific discovery, potentially leading to breakthroughs that could benefit humanity's long-term survival. Her research faction included many of the fort's intellectuals, medical personnel, and those who believed that knowledge was their greatest weapon against any threat. Zephyra found herself caught between these opposing philosophies, her medical oath to do no harm conflicting with her growing fear for the community's safety. She understood Lyralii's desire for scientific understanding, but she also recognized the validity of Ezekiel's concerns about the immediate threat. Her position as the fort's primary medical authority gave her significant influence, and both factions actively courted her support. Thaddeus watched helplessly as the community he had helped build began to fragment along ideological lines. His attempts to find middle ground between the factions were met with increasing resistance from both sides, each of which viewed compromise as tantamount to surrender. The daily council meetings became verbal battlegrounds where reasoned discussion gave way to passionate arguments and personal attacks. The situation deteriorated further when Corvina announced her intention to undertake another reconnaissance mission, this time with the goal of attempting to communicate with the intelligent zombies. Her proposal horrified Ezekiel's faction, who viewed any contact with the enemy as potentially suicidal and strategically dangerous. Lyraliai's supporters, however, saw it as a logical next step in understanding their evolved adversaries. Donovan found himself torn between his loyalty to Corvina and his growing concerns about the risks she was proposing to take. Their relationship had deepened during their recent mission together, but he struggled with the idea of supporting what many viewed as a reckless endangerment of someone he cared about deeply. His internal conflict reflected the broader tensions within the community, where personal relationships were strained by ideological differences. The debate over Corvina's proposed mission came to a head during a particularly heated council session. Ezekiel argued that any attempt at communication would reveal Fort Meridian's location and capabilities to an intelligent enemy, potentially triggering the very coordinated attack they were trying to prevent. Lyraliai countered that understanding zombie intelligence might lead to peaceful coexistence or even alliance against other threats they hadn't yet encountered. Kalen, whose investigative instincts had kept the community alive through countless crises, found himself increasingly isolated as he developed a third perspective that neither faction wanted to hear. His analysis of the available evidence suggested that the zombie evolution was not random but directed, possibly by some form of collective intelligence that surpassed individual human consciousness. He believed that both aggressive action and attempted communication were equally likely to provoke a response that Fort Meridian could not survive. Young Solace continued to provide unique insights into zombie behavior, but her observations were now viewed through the lens of factional politics. When she reported seeing zombies engaged in what appeared to be artistic expression, creating crude sculptures from debris, the militants dismissed her account as childish imagination while the researchers seized upon it as evidence of emergent consciousness that deserved protection rather than destruction. The fracture within the community was made manifest when a group of Ezekiel's most fervent supporters began conducting unauthorized patrols beyond the fort's perimeter, seeking to engage zombie groups in preemptive combat. Their first expedition resulted in the loss of 2 experienced fighters and provided evidence that the zombies were indeed capable of tactical thinking and coordinated defense of their territory. Meanwhile, members of Lyraliai's faction began conducting secret experiments designed to test zombie intelligence levels, using captured specimens in ways that violated established safety protocols. Their research yielded fascinating results about zombie learning capabilities and memory retention, but it also increased the risk of containment breaches that could threaten the entire community. Zephyra found herself treating injuries from both unauthorized military actions and laboratory accidents, becoming an unwilling witness to the destructive effects of the community's internal divisions. Her medical bay became a neutral ground where members of both factions could coexist, bound together by their shared vulnerability and need for healing. The final blow to community unity came when surveillance teams reported that zombie groups in the surrounding area had begun coordinating their movements in response to the unauthorized patrols. The evidence suggested that the undead were not just aware of Fort Meridian's existence but were actively studying human behavior and adapting their strategies accordingly. The community's internal conflict had inadvertently provided their enemies with valuable intelligence about human weaknesses and divisions. As winter approached, bringing with it the promise of harsh weather and reduced visibility, Fort Meridian faced the terrifying prospect of confronting an intelligent and organized enemy while simultaneously struggling with internal divisions that threatened to destroy them from within. The fracture that had begun with philosophical differences was becoming a chasm that might ultimately prove more dangerous than any external threat. The harsh winds of early November carried more than just the promise of winter. They brought with them a darkness that seemed to seep into the very soul of Fort Meridian. The unauthorized actions of both factions had escalated beyond mere ideological disagreement into active sabotage of each other's efforts, creating a dangerous spiral of distrust and paranoia that made effective defense nearly impossible. Corvina had grown increasingly frustrated with the Council's inability to authorize her communication mission, and her patience finally reached its breaking point when she discovered that Ezekiel's supporters had been actively sabotaging her equipment. The specialized radio gear she had been modifying to attempt zombie communication had been systematically dismantled, its components scattered throughout the fort's electronic storage area. The deliberate destruction of months of careful preparation felt like a personal betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound. In response to this sabotage, she made a decision that would haunt the community forever. Without authorization and without backup, Corvina slipped out of Fort Meridian during the early morning hours when the watch rotation changed. She carried with her only basic supplies and a simplified communication device she had constructed in secret, determined to prove that contact with the evolved zombies was possible. Donovan discovered her absence during the morning roll call, and his immediate panic spread through the community like wildfire. The search teams that Thaddeus hastily organized were hampered by the very internal divisions that had driven Corvina to her desperate action. Ezekiel's faction insisted on approaching the search as a military operation, while Lyraliai's supporters demanded a more cautious scientific approach that would avoid provoking zombie retaliation. The delay caused by these arguments proved fatal. When the search teams finally reached the zombie settlement that Corvina and Donovan had previously observed, they found evidence of a struggle but no sign of their missing scout. Broken equipment and torn clothing suggested that Corvina had indeed made contact with the zombie population, but the outcome of that contact remained terrifyingly unclear. Zephyra worked frantically to treat Donovan's psychological collapse following the discovery of Corvina's disappearance. His guilt over not preventing her unauthorized mission combined with his terror at her unknown fate created a complete emotional breakdown that left him catatonic for days. Watching this vibrant young man reduced to a shell of his former self was a stark reminder of how the community's internal conflicts were destroying lives in ways that went far beyond political disagreement. The search for Corvina continued for 3 agonizing days, during which Fort Meridian's defensive capabilities were severely compromised by the deployment of their best personnel in reconnaissance roles. It was during this vulnerable period that the zombies launched their most sophisticated attack yet, demonstrating strategic thinking that exceeded even the pessimistic predictions of Kalen's threat assessments. The attack began not with the usual frontal assault on the walls but with a coordinated infiltration attempt that suggested intimate knowledge of Fort Meridian's defensive weaknesses. Small groups of zombies emerged from concealment at multiple points around the perimeter simultaneously, forcing the defenders to spread their limited forces across too many fronts. The timing of the attack, coinciding with the community's distraction over Corvina's disappearance, was too precise to be coincidental. Ezekiel's military experience proved invaluable in coordinating the defense, but even his expertise was challenged by an enemy that anticipated human tactical responses and adapted accordingly. The zombies used crude tools to attempt breaching the walls while other groups created diversions that drew defenders away from more vulnerable access points. Most disturbing of all was evidence that they were communicating during the battle, coordinating their assault through a complex system of signals that allowed them to respond to changing battlefield conditions. The attack was ultimately repelled, but at a terrible cost. 7 community members lost their lives, including Thaddeus Grimwald, whose leadership had held Fort Meridian together through countless previous crises. His death during the defense of the Eastern Gate created a leadership vacuum that neither faction was prepared to fill, plunging the community into even deeper chaos at the moment when unity was most desperately needed. Lyraliai, despite her previous focus on research over military concerns, found herself thrust into a leadership role she never wanted. Her scientific background made her acutely aware of how little they truly understood about their evolving enemy, while the fresh graves in their cemetery served as stark reminders of the deadly consequences of that ignorance. The weight of responsibility for the community's survival pressed down on her like a physical burden. Young Solace, traumatized by witnessing Thaddeus's death during the attack, began experiencing nightmares that were disturbingly prophetic. Her dreams featured vast armies of organized zombies marching across a landscape of human ruins, led by figures that retained enough humanity to be recognizable as former people. The child's artwork became increasingly dark and complex, depicting scenarios that seemed to anticipate future developments in ways that unsettled even the adults who viewed them. Kalen's investigation into the attack's coordination revealed disturbing evidence that the zombies had been conducting surveillance of Fort Meridian for weeks, possibly months. Hidden observation posts created from camouflage debris were discovered at strategic locations around the perimeter, each positioned to provide optimal viewing angles of human activities. The level of planning and patience required for such extended reconnaissance was profoundly troubling. Most horrifying of all was the discovery of crude maps scratched into the walls of abandoned buildings near the zombie settlement. These primitive diagrams showed detailed layouts of Fort Meridian's defenses, complete with notations that suggested understanding of guard rotations, weak points in the walls, and the locations of critical infrastructure. The maps were too accurate to have been created without extensive observation and analysis. As November's darkness deepened, the community faced the terrible realization that their enemy was not just intelligent but actively studying them with the patience and thoroughness of a predator stalking its prey. Corvina remained missing, Donovan remained catatonic, and their leadership structure had been shattered by loss and internal division. The falling dark was not just the approach of winter but the shadow of their own possible extinction. In the depths of despair that followed Thaddeus's death and Corvina's disappearance, an unexpected discovery emerged from Lyraliai's research that would challenge everything the survivors thought they knew about their situation. While examining brain tissue samples from zombies killed during the recent attack, she noticed anomalous cellular structures that defied conventional understanding of the plague's effects on human neurology. These structures appeared to be not just preserving neural function but actively enhancing it in ways that suggested the possibility of reversibility. The implications were staggering. If the zombie condition could potentially be reversed, then every creature they had been fighting might once again become human. This possibility reframed the entire conflict from an existential struggle between species to a medical crisis requiring treatment rather than warfare. Lyraliai's findings offered a glimmer of hope that had seemed impossible just days earlier, but they also raised profound ethical questions about the nature of their defensive actions. Zephyra threw herself into collaborative research with an intensity that surprised even those who knew her best. Her medical background provided crucial insights into the potential mechanisms of reversal, and together she and Lyraliai began developing theoretical protocols for treating zombie subjects. The work was painstaking and dangerous, requiring close examination of active specimens in ways that violated every safety procedure they had established. The research team expanded to include several other community members who possessed relevant expertise, creating an unofficial scientific coalition that transcended the previous factional divisions. Kalen contributed his investigative skills to help piece together the epidemiological patterns of the original outbreak, while even some of Ezekiel's military supporters provided tactical knowledge about zombie behavior that proved valuable for research purposes. Their breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Solace, whose childish drawings had been dismissed by many adults as irrelevant trauma responses, provided a crucial insight when she observed that zombies in her nightmares always appeared to be searching for something they had lost. Her innocent question about whether the creatures might be trying to remember how to be human again sparked a line of inquiry that revolutionized their understanding of zombie consciousness. Building on Solace's observation, the research team began examining the possibility that zombie aggression was not predatory hunger but a desperate attempt to recover lost humanity through contact with living humans. This theory suggested that the creatures were driven not by malice but by a profound sense of loss and confusion, making them tragic figures rather than monsters. The distinction was more than academic, it provided a potential pathway for therapeutic intervention. Donovan's gradual recovery from his catatonic state coincided with these research developments, and his first-hand knowledge of Corvina's behavior patterns proved invaluable in predicting where she might have gone and what she might have attempted. His growing conviction that she was still alive somewhere, possibly attempting to communicate with zombie leaders, provided motivation for the research team's increasingly ambitious treatment protocols. The first experimental treatment was conducted on a recently captured zombie specimen under conditions of extreme security and caution. The protocol involved a combination of neurochemical interventions designed to restore damaged neural pathways and cognitive behavioral techniques adapted from human amnesia treatment. The results were modest but encouraging, with the subject showing increased responsiveness to verbal commands and reduced aggressive behavior. Ezekiel initially opposed the treatment experiments as dangerous waste of resources that could better be spent on defensive preparations, but even his military pragmatism was challenged by the potential implications of success. If zombies could be restored to humanity, then the long-term survival of their species might depend on developing treatment capabilities rather than simply maintaining defensive positions until their resources were exhausted. The ethical dimensions of their research created new forms of internal debate that were more productive than the previous factional conflicts. Questions about consent, risk assessment, and resource allocation required careful consideration of values and priorities that went beyond simple survival calculations. These discussions helped rebuild the community's sense of shared purpose and moral foundation. Progress accelerated when the team discovered that zombie neural enhancement appeared to be most reversible in recently turned subjects, suggesting that early intervention could prevent the permanent cognitive changes that made treatment impossible in older specimens. This finding provided hope for future victims of zombie attacks while also establishing urgent timelines for treatment development. The most significant breakthrough came when Lyralii successfully restored partial memory function in their test subject, who began displaying recognition of human speech patterns and even attempting vocalization. The creature's attempts to speak were heartbreaking in their obvious struggle against damaged vocal cords and cognitive confusion, but they represented undeniable evidence that the human consciousness could survive zombie transformation. Young Solace's interaction with the partially restored subject provided the most compelling evidence of treatment success. The zombie, when presented with one of Solace's drawings, showed clear emotional responses that suggested retained capacity for aesthetic appreciation and empathy. The creature's careful handling of the artwork and apparent attempts to communicate about it convinced even skeptical observers that genuine restoration was possible. As winter deepened around Fort Meridian, the research team worked with growing urgency to develop scalable treatment protocols that could potentially be applied to larger zombie populations. Their success had transformed the community's understanding of their situation from hopeless siege to medical emergency requiring intervention rather than elimination. The glimmer of hope that emerged from their research was fragile and uncertain, but it provided something that had been missing from their struggle for survival: the possibility that their enemies might someday become their neighbors again. This possibility would soon be tested in ways none of them could anticipate, as events beyond their control were already in motion that would determine the fate of both human and zombie populations. Word of Fort Meridian's research breakthrough spread through the zombie population faster than anyone had anticipated, carried by communication networks that the survivors were only beginning to understand. The partially restored test subject had somehow managed to transmit information about the treatment protocols to other zombies during brief periods when laboratory security was relaxed, creating a cascade of responses throughout the regional undead population that defied all previous behavioral patterns. Zephyra first noticed the change during her morning medical rounds when she observed that zombie activity visible from the fort's walls had shifted dramatically overnight. Instead of the random wandering that had characterized zombie behavior for years, the creatures were now moving with obvious purpose toward Fort Meridian, but not in the aggressive formations that typically preceded an attack. They moved slowly and deliberately, maintaining distance from the walls while establishing what could only be described as an organized encampment. Kalen's investigation teams reported similar developments across all approach routes to the fort. Zombie groups from throughout the region were converging on their location, but their behavior suggested pilgrimage rather than warfare. Many carried crude banners fashioned from salvaged materials, and some had modified their appearance in ways that seemed designed to communicate peaceful intentions rather than hostility. The most stunning development was the arrival of Corvina, accompanied by a delegation of zombie leaders who had undergone partial restoration through techniques that appeared more advanced than anything Fort Meridian had achieved. Her reappearance after weeks of assumed death created emotional chaos within the community, particularly for Donovan, whose joy at her survival was tempered by profound confusion about the circumstances of her return. Corvina's account of her time among the zombies revolutionized their understanding of the creature's society and motivations. She had not been captured or harmed but had been welcomed into a complex civilization that retained many human cultural elements while developing unique adaptations to their transformed condition. The zombie leaders had been conducting their own research into reversing their condition, working with fragmentary memories of scientific knowledge retained from their human lives. The delegation that accompanied Corvina included former scientists, military personnel, and community leaders who had retained enough cognitive function to serve as intermediaries between human and zombie populations. Their ability to communicate in broken but comprehensible human speech allowed for the first genuine dialogue between the species since the original outbreak, opening possibilities that no one had dared to imagine. Lyralii found herself at the center of unprecedented scientific collaboration as zombie researchers shared their findings about neural restoration techniques that had been developed through trial and error over months of desperate experimentation. Their methods were crude but effective, and when combined with Fort Meridian's more sophisticated medical capabilities, they produced treatment protocols that exceeded anything either group had achieved independently. The arrival of the zombie delegation created intense debate within Fort Meridian about how to respond to this unexpected opportunity for cooperation. Ezekiel's military instincts warned against trusting former enemies who might be using deception to infiltrate their defenses, while Lyralii's scientific curiosity was overwhelmed by the research possibilities that collaboration might provide. Zephyra emerged as a crucial mediator in these negotiations, her medical background providing common ground between human and zombie concerns about treatment safety and effectiveness. Her ability to communicate the medical principles underlying their research in terms that the zombie scientists could understand helped establish trust between the two groups despite their obvious differences. The collaboration that developed over the following weeks was unlike anything in recorded history. Human and zombie researchers worked side by side in expanded laboratory facilities, sharing knowledge and techniques while developing treatment protocols that could potentially restore entire populations to humanity. The work was slow and dangerous, requiring constant vigilance against the possibility of treatment failures that could threaten everyone involved. Young Solace became an unexpected ambassador between the two species, her childish innocence allowing her to interact with zombie subjects without the fear and revulsion that affected most adults. Her drawings began depicting scenes of cooperation and restoration that seemed to inspire both human and zombie participants in the research efforts. The most significant challenge was developing treatment delivery systems that could reach the massive zombie populations gathering around Fort Meridian. The numbers had swelled to tens of thousands, creating logistical problems that tested every aspect of the fort's infrastructure and resources. The creatures waited with remarkable patience, but their basic needs for shelter and sustenance created environmental pressures that threatened the stability of the entire region. Donovan struggled with complex emotions about Corvina's transformation during her time away. While she remained fundamentally human, her exposure to zombie society had changed her in ways that created distance between them despite their obvious love for each other. Her new understanding of zombie consciousness and culture had given her perspectives that were difficult for someone who had never experienced life among the undead to fully comprehend. As winter reached its harshest point, the gathering storm was not just meteorological but social and political. The convergence of human and zombie populations around Fort Meridian had created an unprecedented situation that would require entirely new forms of organization and cooperation to manage successfully. The research breakthrough that had seemed like salvation now appeared to be only the beginning of challenges that would test the limits of both species' capacity for adaptation and trust. The fate of millions of transformed humans hung in the balance as the two groups worked desperately to develop scalable solutions to what had become the greatest medical crisis in human history. Success would mean the restoration of civilization on a scale never before attempted, while failure could result in the complete collapse of both human and zombie societies. The breakthrough came on the coldest night of winter when Lyralii and her mixed-species research team achieved stable neural restoration in a severely degraded zombie subject who had been considered beyond hope of recovery. The success required a combination of human medical technology and zombie-developed techniques that neither group could have achieved alone, proving that cooperation between the species was not just beneficial but absolutely essential for solving their shared crisis. The restored subject, a former teacher named Marcus who had retained fragments of pedagogical knowledge throughout his zombie condition, became living proof that even the most damaged victims of the plague could potentially return to full humanity. His emotional reunion with cognitive functions he had lost years earlier provided powerful motivation for scaling up the treatment protocols to address the massive population of zombies still gathering around Fort Meridian. Ezekiel found his military skepticism gradually giving way to logistical pragmatism as he recognized that managing the restoration process would require organizational capabilities that exceeded anything in his previous experience. The sheer numbers of subjects requiring treatment demanded coordination between human and zombie resources on a scale that made traditional military hierarchy inadequate for the task at hand. The establishment of treatment centers throughout the expanded camp became a massive engineering project that pushed both species to develop new forms of cooperation and trust. Human technical expertise combined with zombie physical capabilities to construct facilities that could process hundreds of patients simultaneously while maintaining the safety protocols necessary to prevent treatment failures that could endanger everyone involved. Zephyra took charge of training programs that prepared both human and zombie personnel to administer the complex treatment protocols safely and effectively. Her medical authority transcended species boundaries as she worked to establish standards and procedures that could ensure consistent results across multiple treatment centers operating under challenging field conditions. The process was not without failures and setbacks that tested everyone's commitment to the restoration project. Treatment complications resulted in several deaths and partial restorations that left subjects in distressing liminal states between human and zombie consciousness. Each failure provided valuable data for improving the protocols, but the human cost of learning through trial and error was emotionally devastating for all involved. Corvina and Donovan found their relationship strengthened by working together on the massive logistical challenges of coordinating between human and zombie populations. Their shared experience of loss and recovery created a bond that transcended the species barriers that had initially complicated their reunion, and their partnership became a model for the kind of cooperation that made the entire project possible. Kalen's investigative skills proved crucial in developing quality control systems that could track treatment outcomes across the entire population and identify patterns that might indicate problems with specific protocols or procedures. His work helped establish the data collection systems that would be essential for evaluating the long-term success of the restoration effort. Young Solace continued to serve as an emotional bridge between species, her artwork documenting the transformation process in ways that helped both humans and zombies understand the psychological dimensions of restoration. Her drawings showed not just the medical aspects of treatment but the emotional journey that subjects underwent as they recovered memories and relationships that had been lost to the plague. The most challenging aspect of the restoration process was managing the social and cultural implications of bringing together populations that had been enemies for years. Many restored subjects struggled with memories of their actions during their zombie period, while human survivors found it difficult to accept former zombies as neighbors and equals despite their restoration to humanity. Lyralii worked tirelessly to address these integration challenges by developing support programs that helped restored subjects adjust to human society while also educating the human population about the psychological impacts of the plague and restoration process. Her efforts to create understanding between the groups were essential for preventing social conflicts that could undermine the entire project. The weather itself became an adversary as winter storms threatened the stability of the expanded camp and complicated the delivery of medical supplies necessary for maintaining treatment operations. The cooperation between human and zombie populations in weathering these natural disasters helped build trust and mutual dependence that transcended their previous antagonisms. As spring approached, the restoration project had achieved success rates that exceeded even optimistic projections, with over 60% of treated subjects achieving full recovery and most others showing significant improvement in cognitive function and social behavior. The numbers represented not just medical victories but the potential foundation for rebuilding human civilization on a scale that had seemed impossible just months earlier. The crucible of winter had transformed both species through shared struggle and mutual support, creating bonds that would be essential for addressing the enormous challenges of reintegrating restored populations into functioning society. The success of the treatment programs was only the beginning of a larger project of rebuilding civilization that would require continued cooperation between groups that had been mortal enemies for years. The camp around Fort Meridian had become something unprecedented in human history, a functioning society that included both human survivors and restored former zombies working together toward common goals. The model they had created would soon be tested by the need to expand these successes to regional and eventually global scales. Spring arrived with a warmth that seemed to carry hope itself, as the restored community around Fort Meridian had grown into something that transcended the simple survival that had once defined human existence. The settlement now housed over 40,000 people, roughly split between original human survivors and those who had been restored from zombie condition, creating a unique society that was simultaneously familiar and entirely new. Zephyra stood in the expanded medical complex, watching as the last of the winter treatment patients completed their recovery protocols. The young woman who emerged from the treatment chamber had been a zombie for 3 years, but her restoration was so complete that only the faint scars from her original transformation remained as evidence of her ordeal. The tears of joy from her restored family members had become a daily occurrence that never lost its emotional impact. The success of Fort Meridian's restoration project had attracted attention from survivor communities across the continent, with delegations arriving weekly to learn the treatment protocols and establish their own restoration centers. Lyralii had established a training academy that was producing medical personnel capable of administering the complex procedures, while Kalen coordinated communication networks that shared vital information between settlements. Corvina and Donovan had married in a ceremony that included both human traditions and cultural elements developed by zombie communities during their years of separation from human society. Their wedding represented more than personal happiness. It symbolized the possibility of unity between groups that had once seemed irreconcilably different. The celebration drew participants from across the expanded community, with restored former zombies contributing musical and artistic traditions that enriched human culture. Ezekiel had adapted his military experience to the challenges of coordinating security for a community that was constantly growing as more zombie populations sought restoration treatment. His forces now included both human survivors and restored former zombies, creating military units that possessed unique capabilities for dealing with the remaining feral zombie populations that had not yet been reached by treatment programs. The agricultural programs that sustained the expanded community had developed innovative techniques that combined human farming knowledge with insights gained from zombie observations of natural ecosystems during their years of existence outside human society. The food production capabilities that resulted from this collaboration exceeded anything that either group could have achieved independently. Young Solace had become something of a cultural icon, her artwork documenting the transformation of their society in ways that helped people understand the emotional dimensions of their unprecedented situation. Her drawings now depicted scenes of cooperation and shared celebration that seemed to capture the spirit of hope that pervaded the community. Thaddeus's grave had become a memorial garden where people of both backgrounds came to remember those who had been lost during the dark years of conflict. The monument bore inscriptions in both human languages and the symbolic communication systems that had developed among zombie communities, representing the dual heritage that now defined their society. The research that had begun as a desperate attempt to understand zombie intelligence had evolved into comprehensive studies of consciousness, identity, and the nature of humanity itself. The insights gained from restoration treatments were advancing scientific understanding in ways that promised benefits far beyond addressing the immediate crisis of the plague. Trade networks had been established with other survivor communities, exchanging medical knowledge for resources and technologies that supported continued expansion of restoration capabilities. The economic relationships that developed were based on cooperation rather than competition, reflecting the collaborative values that had emerged from their shared struggle for survival. Yet challenges remained that tempered the optimism of their achievements. Not all zombie subjects could be successfully restored, and the communities of permanently transformed individuals required ongoing support and integration efforts. The psychological impacts of restoration were complex and sometimes lasting, requiring continued medical and social support for many recovered individuals. Weather monitoring systems established by Kalen's teams indicated that climate changes caused by the collapse of human industrial civilization were creating environmental challenges that would require coordinated responses from all communities. The cooperation that had developed around medical restoration would need to expand to address these larger threats to human and post-human survival. As summer approached, Zephyra found herself pregnant with a child who would grow up in a world that offered possibilities her generation could never have imagined. The baby would be among the first to be raised in an integrated society where the distinction between human and restored human was becoming less significant with each passing day. The morning light that streamed through the windows of the medical complex illuminated charts showing restoration success rates that continued to improve as techniques were refined and experience accumulated. The data represented more than medical achievements, it documented the rebirth of human civilization through cooperation, understanding, and the determination to heal rather than destroy. Fort Meridian had become something unprecedented, not just a refuge for human survivors but a beacon of hope for the restoration of all humanity. The new dawn that broke over their expanded community each day illuminated a future where the horrors of the plague years might someday be remembered as the dark night that preceded an unprecedented flowering of human cooperation and understanding. The story of their struggle would be told for generations, not just as a tale of survival against overwhelming odds but as proof that even the most desperate circumstances could be transformed through compassion, scientific dedication, and the courage to see humanity in all its forms. The zombies who had once threatened to destroy civilization had instead become partners in rebuilding it stronger and more inclusive than ever before.